They came for her before dawn, while she was still asleep in her own bed. Spring, 1898. Armed men walked into her rooms, took a 40-year-old woman who was neither sick nor confused, and carried her away to be locked inside an asylum for the insane. She was the daughter of the richest king in Europe, and when word reached her father that his daughter had just been dragged out of her bed and committed, he did not send help. He sent an order: guard her more closely. This is the story of a woman who was given nearly everything a fortune could buy and denied the one thing she wanted most: the right to her own life. Welcome back to Crown Secrets and Scandals, where we go past the portraits and the titles to the women history preferred to forget. If this is the kind of story you come back for, the subscribe button is right there, and it costs you nothing but a click. In the winter of 1921, in a rented apartment in Paris, an old woman sat down to write the story of her life. She had no fortune left. She had no family who would open their door to her. What she had was a stack of paper, a failing income, and a grievance the size of an empire. Her name was Louise of Belgium, and she had been born into more wealth than almost any woman then alive. Her father was King Leopold II, the second monarch of the Belgians, and by most measures the richest king in Europe. He commanded a private fortune so vast that governments struggled to trace it. His eldest daughter grew up in palaces at Laeken and Brussels, surrounded by servants, jewels, and the quiet certainty that she belonged to one of the most powerful houses on the continent. And yet, if you had gone looking for that daughter in the last years of her life, you would not have found her in a palace. You would have found her moving from one cheap set of rooms to the next, one step ahead of the people she owed. At one point in Budapest, soldiers came to search her home. One of them looked around at the bare walls and said, almost in disbelief, that here lived a princess poorer than he was. The exact wording of this soldier's remark should be treated as an anecdote rather than a verified quotation. How does that happen? How does the daughter of the wealthiest king of her age end her days with nothing? That is the question this story answers. And the answer is not misfortune. It is not bad luck or a fortune lost to gambling or war. The answer is that the people who were meant to protect her, her father, her husband, and in time her own son, decided, one by one, that she was more useful to them silenced than free. To understand how any of this was possible, we have to go back to the beginning, to a nursery in Brussels, to a little girl who asked too many questions, and to the single loss that would shadow the rest of her life. The children of King Leopold II were raised in rooms that would have surprised you, not for their grandeur, for their bareness. Hard beds, cold baths in the morning, formal, rationed hours with their parents, measured out like medicine. This was the English fashion of the day, and the king approved of it. He believed a royal childhood should be a training, not a comfort. Into that cool, correct world, on the 18th of February, 1858, Louise was born. She was the first child, and from the very first, there was a flaw in her arrival that no discipline could correct. She was a girl. Belgium in those years followed a simple, unbending rule of succession. A woman could not inherit the throne. What the king needed, what the young dynasty needed, was a son. Louise was welcomed and dressed and displayed, but she was not the answer to the question her father was asking. A year later, that answer came. A boy was born, another Leopold, and the palace exhaled. Louise grew up bright, quick, and impossible to satisfy with a simple reply. She asked so many questions that the household gave her a nickname: Madame Pourquoi, Madame Why. You can picture the kind of child that produces a name like that. The one at the edge of the adult conversation. The one who wants to know not just what happened, but why. And why again after that. It is an appealing quality in a story. It was less appealing, one suspects, in a 19th century royal nursery, where a princess was meant to absorb her instructions and not interrogate them. Her relationship with her father was distant in a very particular way. It was not that Leopold was cruel to her in these years. It was that he was barely there at all. She would later say that she always saw him more as her king than as her father. A sovereign to be observed from the correct distance, not a parent to run to. His affection, when it came, was rare and brief. His attention was elsewhere. On the machinery of the state, on the fortune he was assembling, on the ambitions that would one day make his name famous and infamous across the world. The warmth in Louise's childhood came from two people. One was her mother, Queen Marie Henriette, a horsewoman and a musician, strict but present. The other was her little brother, Leopold, the boy, the heir, the answer, who was to Louise something closer to her own. She adored him with the fierce, uncomplicated love of an older sister for a younger child. In her memoir, written half a century later, she reached for words that still tremble on the page. Her brother, she wrote, embodied for her, after their mother, all that was most precious in the world. She could no more imagine life without him than she could imagine the day without light. And then, in the winter of 1869, the light went out. The boy was playing near one of the ponds at Laeken when he fell into the cold water. What began as a chill settled into his chest and became pneumonia. There was no antibiotic in that century, no reliable weapon against it, only nursing and prayer and waiting. The Queen never left his bedside. For a few days in September, he seemed to rally. Then he sank again through the autumn and into the new year, until, on the 22nd of January, 1869, he died. He was 9 years old. Louise was 10. She understood exactly what was happening, and she prayed at his bedside before she was taken away to say goodbye. Decades later, she was still writing about it as an open wound. She confessed that in her grief she had dared to curse God, to deny him. She said she could no longer conceive of an existence without her brother, and she added a line that tells you how deep the cut went, that more than 50 years later, she still wept for him. It is worth pausing on what this death meant, because it did not only break a little girl's heart, it broke the shape of the whole family. For the king, it was a catastrophe of state. His only son, his only heir, was gone. Belgium's crown could not pass to a daughter, and so Leopold's entire relationship with his 3 girls curdled into something colder and more calculating. If he could not have a son to inherit, then his daughters became the only instruments he had left. Pieces to be placed on the board of European power, married outward to secure alliances, to bind other houses close. He would try again for a boy. A 3rd daughter, Clementine, arrived in 1872. And after her, the king seemed to withdraw from his family altogether, turning his back on the domestic life that had failed to give him what he wanted. For the Queen, it was a grief she never fully surfaced from. The marriage, already strained, drifted further apart in the years that followed. And for Louise, It was the end of the only unconditional love she had known inside those palace walls. Her mother was distant now, buried in her own sorrow. Her father regarded her, when he regarded her at all, as an asset with a future price. The one person who had loved her simply for being his sister was in the ground. She was, in every way that a wealthy, entitled child can be, alone. You can already see in this early portrait the two forces that would tear at her for the rest of her life. On one side, a headstrong, questioning, passionate girl who wanted to be loved. Madame Why, who could never quite stop asking for a reason. On the other, a father who had decided that his daughters were not people to be loved, but problems to be solved. Resources to be spent in the service of the dynasty. For a few more years, those two forces held in an uneasy balance. Louise was still a child, and a child could be overlooked. She rode with her mother. She loved the gardens and the open space at Laeken. She grew into a striking young woman, tall, with something of her father in her features and her upright carriage, and something of her mother in a dreaming, private quality that made her seem at times like a person only half in the room. But she was the eldest daughter of a king who now saw his daughters as currency, and currency exists to be spent. She was not quite 17 when her father found a use for her. The candidate arrived the way such things always did, through negotiation, not affection. His name was Prince Philip of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. He belonged to the wealthy Hungarian branch of the family. He lived in Vienna, and he had already asked for Louise's hand twice before. He was a second cousin, closely enough related that the marriage would require a special dispensation from the Pope. He was also 31 years old. Louise was not yet 17. The king had his reasons, and they were sound ones for the king. Philip was rich, which mattered a great deal to a father who wished to spend as little of his own money as possible. He was connected to half the courts of Europe. And crucially, he was not the wrong kind of alliance at the wrong moment. Louise's mother favored the match for a warmer reason. It would carry her daughter to the glittering imperial court of Vienna, the world Marie Henriette herself had come from. What nobody appears to have consulted in any meaningful way was Louise. She had been kept at the edge of the negotiations about her own future. When she was finally told, she reached back into her memory for the few times she had glimpsed this older cousin during his visits to Brussels, and she persuaded herself that she knew him, that she had always known him. She was a romantic girl. She looked forward to being married. She had, in her own later words, given herself over to a kind of ethereal confidence about the marriage to come, without in the least understanding what it might actually be. The betrothal was celebrated in 1874, when she was still 15, and held for a year because she was too young to wed. On the 4th of February, 1875, they were married at the Royal Palace in Brussels. She was 2 weeks shy of 17. Then came the night. Louise had been told nothing. This was not unusual for a girl of her class and century. A bride was often kept in a state of deliberate innocence, handed from the schoolroom to the marriage bed with no map of what waited there. But the gap between what she had imagined and what she encountered was, for her, a kind of fall. Years later, choosing her words with great care, she described it as tumbling from a heaven of love onto what was for her a bed of rock and a mattress of thorns. What we know for certain is what she did next. When Philip left in the early morning, The new princess got up, put on her nightgown, a cloak, and a pair of slippers, and fled the bridal chamber. She ran out into the cold, into the glass orangery on the palace grounds, and hid herself there among the camellia blossoms. A cavalier found her among the flowers. He brought her back to her parents. Consider that scene for a moment, because it tells you everything about the machine she had been fed into. Her father, the king, did not get out of bed. Her mother came to her and comforted her not with rescue, but with a lecture. Louise remembered being told, through her tears, that next time she must be less uncooperative, that this was her duty. In her own harsher account, she listened while her mother scolded her, and did not dare to protest that all of this was completely different from what she had once been promised. There was no next act in which the family reconsidered. Within days, the machinery of departure was already moving. And here is a detail worth holding on to, because it is small and it says so much. When Louise left Belgium for her new life, she was not permitted to bring a single one of her own maids. She left the only home she had ever known, young, frightened, and entirely alone beside a man she barely knew, bound for a city where she knew no one. The marriage that followed was not, on paper, a violent one, but it was corrosive from the start. In the early weeks, by her account, Philip pressed her to drink more than she was accustomed to and made coarse jokes at her expense. He was a man of appetites who saw no reason to abandon them for a wife, and he continued his own pleasures, much as he had before the wedding. He was, in the plainest terms, not faithful, and not especially interested in pretending otherwise. 2 children came, as they were expected to. A son, Leopold Clement, in 1878. A daughter, Dorothea, in 1881. There is a small, telling detail even here. When Dorothea was born, Louise did not want Philip present and hid the pains of her labor for as long as she could. When the midwife was finally summoned, she arrived too late. So did the husband. This was the marriage. A teenage bride who had run from her own wedding bed. A husband who barely noticed she had gone. 2 children born into a household that had never, for a single day, been a home. And around them, all the while, turned the most dazzling court in Europe. Vienna, the Hofburg, the imperial circle of Emperor Franz Joseph, and his famous, beautiful, unhappy empress, Elizabeth, the woman the world called Sisi. Louise was brought into that world as a young Coburg princess, and she looked at the emperor at its center, the most powerful man she had ever met, and formed a private judgment of him that she would keep to herself for decades. When she finally wrote it down, it was merciless. At his birth, she said, nature had deprived him of a heart. She did not yet know how much that verdict would come to matter. She did not yet know that this same emperor, this heartless man at the summit of everything, would one day sign his name to the order that took her freedom away. For now, she was simply a young woman in a marriage she had never chosen, in a court that ran on appetite and appearance, learning slowly and then all at once that no one was going to save her. So she decided to save herself. And in the spring of a year not far off, walking in the great park at the heart of Vienna, she was going to meet the man who would help her try. There is a great park at the heart of Vienna called the Prater. Long avenues of chestnut trees, where the fashionable world went to see and be seen, on horseback and in carriages, in the soft light of a spring afternoon. It was there, in May of 1895, that Louise's life split cleanly into a before and an after. She was 37. Her marriage had long since hollowed into an arrangement she endured rather than lived. She had by this point taken lovers of her own. And here we should be honest about the woman at the center of this story, because this is not a tale of saints. Louise was not a wronged innocent waiting quietly for rescue. She was proud, restless, extravagant, and she had learned to take her pleasures in a court that granted her husband every freedom and shamed her for wanting the same. The double standard was absolute. Philip's affairs were expected, hers were scandals. But what happened in the Prater was not another scandal. It was the thing her whole starved life had been reaching toward. His name was Count Geza Matačić. He was a lieutenant in a Croatian regiment of the Austrian army, and he was some 9 years younger than she was. His title sat a little uneasily on him. He had taken the name and the rank through his mother's second marriage, and there were those who whispered that the Count was not quite as noble as the Count preferred to appear. None of that mattered to Louise. What mattered was that from the moment she saw him, she was lost. She went back to the Prater day after day, hoping to see him again. She went to the opera looking for the same face in the crowd. The following year, promoted and stationed nearby, Geza heard that she was at the Austrian Riviera and presented himself to her at a ball. He was in love, too. She gave him charge of her stables, asked him to teach her to ride, and by the spring made him the manager of her horses, and soon after, of her finances. You can already see the two threads that would later be pulled tight into a noose. A love affair conducted in the full glare of Europe. And a set of money matters. Debts, credit, the management of a princess's tangled finances, placed in the hands of the man she loved. Both would be used against them. Because this affair, unlike the others, did not stay quiet. And it did not fade. Louise made no secret of it. And a Coburg princess, a daughter of the King of the Belgians, openly devoted to a minor Croatian officer, was more than the court was willing to tolerate. Word traveled. Her mother, Queen Marie Henriette, received report after report from her Habsburg relations about her daughter's conduct, and grew frantic. Vienna's newspapers reached for their most lurid comparisons, measuring Louise against the notorious women of history. And at the summit, the emperor himself, Franz Joseph, the man she had privately judged to have no heart, summoned her to answer for herself. In January of 1897, Louise made the choice that would define the rest of her life. She left her husband. Not quietly, not with a discreet separation, but completely. She walked out of the marriage, took her teenage daughter Dorothea with her, and set off across Europe with Geza. Paris, Cannes, the south of France, and beyond. They lived well, and they lived openly, and everywhere they went, they left behind them a trail of unpaid bills and scandalized talk. The family began to close its ranks against her, one member at a time. And this is the part of the story that turns your stomach, because it was not strangers who abandoned her. It was her own blood. Her father and mother sided flatly with the wronged husband. Her sister Stephanie, herself no stranger to a tragic marriage, could not forgive Louise for dragging the family name through the mud, and turned away. Her daughter Dorothea, frightened and counseled by the fiancé she would soon marry, left her mother and went home. And her son, Leopold Clement, came to blame her bitterly for what her scandals were doing to his prospects, to his inheritance, and he chose his father. One by one, the doors were closing, and Louise, who had run from a marriage in search of a life of her own, was discovering that a woman who defies a king does not simply lose an argument. She loses everyone. The husband she had scorned was not finished with her. In 1898, Philip confronted his rival directly and challenged Giza to a duel. It was fought in Vienna, first with pistols, then with swords. And it was fought, by grim coincidence, on the 18th of February, Louise's 40th birthday. Philip lost. He came away injured and humiliated, beaten in front of the whole court by the younger man who had taken his wife. A humiliated prince is a dangerous thing. Philip could not defeat Giza with a sword, so he reached for a weapon far more powerful than any blade, one that required no honor, no fair fight, and no proof that would satisfy a court of law. He would simply have the world declare that his wife had lost her mind. And there were debts now, and a whisper of forgery attached to them, and a family that wanted her silenced, and an emperor with no heart who could make it all official with a signature. Everything Philip needed was falling into place. Louise did not yet know it, but the door that was about to close on her would not be a marriage she could flee, or a family that merely turned its back. It would be a locked one, with a guard outside it. In the spring of 1898, they came for her. And they took her from her bed. There was no trial that a modern person would recognize as one. There was a diagnosis arranged and delivered by men who served the interests of her husband and her family. And on the strength of it, Louise of Belgium, daughter of a king, mother of two, 40 years old, and entirely sane, was carried to an asylum for the insane at Dubling, outside Vienna, and placed in a cell. Sit with that word for a moment. A cell, not a private villa, not a discreet retreat where a difficult woman might be quietly kept. A cell in a madhouse for a princess whose only illness was that she had become inconvenient. The charge that made it all possible was money. There were debts, enormous ones, run up across years of extravagant living, and attached to them now was an accusation of forgery. Giza, it was claimed, had forged signatures on promissory notes, including the name of Louise's own sister, Stephanie, against jewels reportedly worth a fortune. Whether the full truth of that was ever established mattered less than what it enabled. Giza was arrested, stripped of his rank, and thrown into a military prison. And Louise was given a choice that was not a choice at all: return to the husband she had fled, or be committed. She chose the asylum. It tells you everything about the marriage that she considered the madhouse the better of the two. Now, was she mad? This is the question the whole story turns on, and this show will not answer it for you. Because the honest answer is that the people at the time did not agree, and the record they left is deliberately incomplete. Her family insisted she was unwell, unstable, hysterical, a danger to herself and to the family's name. Her mother had once cried out that Louise was a monster who belonged in a madhouse, and now the family had made those words come literally true. But the doctors who would eventually examine her without a stake in the outcome reached a very different conclusion. A later independent evaluation found no need for her confinement at all. And a modern neuropsychiatrist who went back through the surviving documents concluded that her extravagance and her defiance did not, from anything in the record, amount to a mental illness that could justify locking her away. What justified it, he found, was the family's fury over her love affair and a murky business of unpaid debts. In other words, she was not mad by reason of illness. She was mad by reason of state. It was even the title her lover would later give his account of the whole affair, folle par raison d'état. Insane because the state required her to be. What we can say without any hedging is how she was treated once the door had closed. She was watched, moved from institution to institution as the politics required it. When the Austrian press began printing articles sympathetic to her, when public opinion started dangerously to feel sorry for the imprisoned princess, she was quietly transferred out of the empire altogether to a sanatorium in Saxony, where she was harder to reach and harder to rally around. She was given at times a villa in the grounds and a lady in waiting, the gilded trappings of her rank. But the trappings changed nothing. It was still a cage. She herself called one of these places a gilded cage and a tomb. And here is the detail that more than any other tells you what kind of father Leopold II was. When his daughter was locked in the asylum, the king of the Belgians, the richest monarch in Europe, a man who could have secured her release with a word, did involve himself, but not to free her. He sent an instruction to the director of the institution. His daughter was to be strictly guarded. That is the whole of his fatherhood in a single sentence. Not let her go. Not bring her home. Guard her closely. She wrote later about what those years did to her, and her words carry the weight of someone describing a wound rather than an argument. The loss of honor, she said, is as terrible as the loss of reason. She meant it precisely. They had not only taken her freedom, they had taken her good name, branded her mad before the whole of Europe, and left her to wonder whether the endless watching might in time make the lie come true. If she did not lose her mind in that place, she said, it was only because she was not meant to. But she still trembled to think of it. No one came. Not her mother. Not her daughter Dorothea, who stayed away. Not her father, who sent only his instructions. The one relative who showed her any tenderness was an aunt, the Countess of Flanders, who eventually even coaxed the estranged Dorothea into a single visit. Beyond that, silence. The daughter of the wealthiest king of the age sat in a guarded villa in a foreign country, and the world she had been born into simply let her sit there. And then, one gray afternoon, on a supervised carriage ride through the countryside, a boy ran up alongside and threw a folded scrap of paper into her lap. She did not cry out. She did not show it to the attendants beside her. She closed her hand around it and waited until she was alone, and then she unfolded it. On it was written a single word: hope. 4 years after they had taken everything from him, his rank, his freedom, his name, the man they had thrown in prison to break them apart had found her, and he was coming. It happened on the last night of August, 1904. Louise had been permitted to travel to Bad Elster, a spa town in Saxony, to take the waters. Still watched, still shadowed, but a fraction less closely than behind the walls of a sanatorium. Geza had spent months preparing for exactly this moment. Word had been passing to her in fragments, carried by a waiter in her hotel, then by others willing to take the risk. First the note that said, hope. Then, at last, a second message, brief as a heartbeat. It will be tomorrow. That night she did not sleep. She sat up in the dark with her small dog, Kiki, beside her, and a few belongings packed as quietly as she could manage, so as not to give herself away. She waited for a signal in a silence so complete she must have been able to hear her own pulse. Then a night watchman, one of the men meant to keep her, came softly to her door. He was part of the plan. He led her down through the sleeping house to the ground floor. And there, in the darkness, Geza was waiting. Nothing between them now but a few feet of shadow and everything they had already lost. They slipped out to a waiting carriage and drove away through the night, toward the border, toward France, toward the first free air she had breathed in 6 years. Think about who was in that carriage. Not her father, the richest king in Europe, who had sent instructions instead of help. Not her mother, who had scolded her on her wedding night and abandoned her at the asylum gate. Not her daughter who had gone home. Not her son who had chosen the other side. Every person who shared her blood had, at the decisive moment, closed the door and walked away. The man in the carriage was the one they had all told her she was forbidden to love. A minor officer of uncertain title, 9 years younger than she was, who had been stripped of his rank, branded a forger, and locked in a military prison for 4 years, and who had come out the other side with a single purpose: to get her back. He had lost everything he owned in the world, and the only thing he had used it to buy was her freedom. That is the quiet, devastating turn at the heart of this whole story. Louise had been raised to believe that her worth was bound up in her blood, that to be her father's daughter was the highest thing she could be. And in the end, her blood betrayed her, every drop of it. The loyalty came from exactly the place she had been commanded not to look. In France, the machinery of the lie began slowly to come apart. In 1905, a medical examination conducted by the judicial authorities in Paris declared her sane. The plain fact that her family had spent years and a fortune trying to bury. The following year, after 8 long years of proceedings, her marriage to Philip was finally dissolved. On paper, at least, she was free of him. She was free of the asylum. She was, for the first time in her adult life, her own woman. But freedom, it turned out, was not the same as deliverance, because the years on the run had ruined her, and the ruin was about to become permanent. In December of 1909, King Leopold II died, and when his 3 daughters looked at what the wealthiest monarch in Europe had left them, they found nothing. He had seen to it. He had moved his enormous fortune out of their reach into a foundation and into shell companies scattered across Germany and France. And what remained, he had left largely to his mistress, a former courtesan. It was his last act as a father, and it was of a piece with all the others. He reached out from beyond the grave to make certain that the daughter who had defied him would never touch a franc of what should have been hers. Louise went to the funeral. Because of the man she lived with, she was made to keep to the shadows of the ceremony, unwelcome even at her own father's grave. She fought the will in the courts alongside her sister. They lost. Years later, the Belgian state offered the disinherited princesses a settlement, but the war would swallow the timing of it, and by then the damage was done. So here is where the Great Escape delivered her, free and ruined. She and Geza drifted across a Europe sliding toward catastrophe. Munich, Budapest, Paris again, always a little poorer than the year before, always one move ahead of the creditors, selling what little she had left to keep going. The annual pension she drew as a Princess of Belgium was cut. She took out loans against loans. When the First World War came, the Belgian state seized her property because it now counted her, absurdly, as an enemy subject. And in the middle of all of it, in 1916, came one more blow from the 1/4 she might have thought could hurt her no further. Her son, Leopold Clement, the boy who had sided with his father, who had refused for years to see her, died. Not peacefully, and not kindly. By the accounts of his death, his mistress attacked him in a rage, threw acid in his face, shot him, and then took her own life. The precise circumstances of Leopold Clement's death vary between sources and should be treated as an unverified account. Whatever bitterness had stood between mother and son, it would now never be resolved. He was simply gone, and Louise had not been let back into his life in time to say anything at all. Free, widowed of the marriage, disinherited by the father, and now bereaved of the son who had died, still turned against her. The girl who had run into the camellias on her wedding night had wanted, more than anything, a life that was her own. She had it now. It had cost her everyone. There was only one person left who had never once let her go, and his health was failing. By the early 1920s, they had come to rest in Paris, the city, it seemed, where so many of Europe's ruined and exiled hearts finally washed up. They had almost nothing. Louise was in her 60s now, her beauty long since spent in the years of flight and confinement. Her fortune, a memory. And beside her, Geza Matacic, the man who had lost his rank and his freedom and his name for her, was dying. He had been loyal for nearly 30 years, not perfectly. There had been another woman along the way, the one who helped engineer the escape, and the arrangement between the three of them was its own strange story, but loyal in the way that counted most. He had never once handed her back to the people who wanted her caged. When he died in 1923, Louise lost the last person on earth who had chosen her. She outlived him by barely a year. In those final months, she did what the powerless have always done when they have nothing left but their side of the story. She wrote it down. Somewhere in a set of rented rooms, an old woman filled page after page with the record of her life. The court she had lived in, the throne she had watched fall, the husband and the father and the empire that had tried to erase her. She meant it as a vindication, a last argument thrown in the face of everyone who had called her mad and left her to rot. And then she did something so strange that historians still turn it over, looking for the meaning in it. She dedicated the book to her father, not with irony, not with a knife hidden in the words. She dedicated it, this account of her ruin, to the great man, the great king, who was her father. The man who had married her off at 16 for reasons of state, who had sent instructions to keep her caged instead of setting her free, who had reached beyond his own grave to make sure she died with nothing. She gave her life's testimony to him as a gift. What do you do with that? Perhaps it was the deepest wound of all, laid bare. A daughter who, after everything, still wanted the love of the one man who had never given it. Still reaching for the father, even as she catalogued his cruelty. Perhaps she believed that greatness and monstrousness could live in the same man, and that both were true at once. Or perhaps she had simply understood something about herself that she could never escape. That whatever they did to her, whatever they took, there was one thing that had defined her from her first breath and would define her to her last. She had said it, they tell us, more than once across her life. I was born a king's daughter. I shall die a king's daughter. And she did. On the 1st of March, 1924, in the German spa town of Wiesbaden, Louise died. Poor, largely alone, her surviving daughter estranged, her name still shadowed by the lie that had been told about her. The oldest child of the richest king in Europe was buried far from the palaces she had been born into. Here, then, is the whole of it, in the space of a single life. A girl who was given everything a fortune could buy and denied the only two things she ever truly wanted: to choose her own life and to be loved by her own family. A woman who could have purchased almost anything on the continent and could not purchase the one thing that was hers by right: her freedom. When they could not control her, they called her insane. When she escaped, they let her starve. And when she died, the world was content to remember her, if at all, as the mad princess. Which is exactly what they had needed her to be. There is a wide, elegant boulevard in Brussels that still carries her name, the Avenue Louise. Thousands of people walk it every day without the faintest idea who she was. A woman erased so thoroughly that her own street outlived her story. She was not mad. She was inconvenient. And in the house of a great king for a daughter, those two things turned out to mean the same. This has been Crown Secrets and Scandals. If her story stayed with you, there are so many more of these women waiting to be told. Subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one.